Hey guys, it's Shannon from Audio Energy again, and this week we're looking at part 3 of studio design. So stick with us. Cheers. Okay, so today we're looking at studio design, and we've gone over a couple of ideas already. We've looked at the types of rooms, the standard rooms and things that are used. We've also looked at my room last week that I'm preparing for my studio, and on the next level of my studio, and we're getting there. And today I just want to go over a few ideas that we've kind of already touched on, but I want to explain them a little bit better. And the first one of those is isolation. Okay, now isolation is a big part of studio design, and it basically involves separating your room, whether it be a recording area or even a monitoring area. It's about isolating that entire environment in almost like a capsule to separate any noise that travels outside of that room, but also noise that could come inside and interrupt the recording or your monitoring session. So what is isolation all up? How is it made? What is it? How is it done? Okay, well, I'm using the book called, I think it was Studio Design by Philip Newell as one of my main references. It's an extremely in-depth book that explains things well. I can't provide a link for that because it could be infringing on copyright, so you should be able to find a PDF of it out there under Focal Press, so if you just Google that, you should be able to find it. But isolation is basically a room inside a larger room, and the space between one room and the next is designed specifically to isolate the sound inside that room and keep other sounds outside of the room so you don't have interference. Now, if you're recording in the garage or at home or in a small sort of studio, this kind of setup with isolation can actually be very expensive, but it is the way to go. Can you find a way to do a cheap version of it? A little bit. It would involve, especially with the walls and ceilings, yes, you can do a fair bit of isolation. The floor may be a little bit more of a problem, especially if you're have to rebuild the entire room. So it's going to cost a bit of money to do that, but the benefits are that the sound, especially with your absorption inside, which we'll talk about in a minute, the sound that's moving around the room will be dissipated properly, and it will also reduce the amount of noise level outside. Okay, so that's the purpose of isolation, is to keep sound in and keep sound out, as well as the sound traveling through the break between one wall of the inside chamber and the wall of the outside chamber can drastically reduce the dB level that you have inside compared to outside. And we're talking, you can reduce that level by about 3 to 4 times. So where a drum snare is normally can be up to about 110 dB thereabouts, you can actually reduce that down to about 40 to 50 dB, probably around 60 dB level outside of that room, which is really not a lot at all, considering an average conversation is about 45 to 55 dB. So you can make that quite low and reduce that sound, especially when you have the right absorption. Now, between the two chambers, the inside chamber and the outside sort of area and wall, there's different sorts of material that you can use, and it comes down to a whole lot of different things, which we'll introduce to our next word or specific meaning, which is absorption. The most number one big critical area of sound control and energy control or acoustic control within a recording space. Absorption. Okay, and it comes down to the types of material on your walls that you're using, that the actual wall itself is made of, and we spoke earlier about gyprock. You can also use other types of walls and foams and things like that. So you would essentially have, as far as construction, you have your inner cell, you have your wall, and then you would have some absorption behind that. So it might be a type of insulation. It could be a wool installation or a fiberglass installation. Then you would have a gap, an open space, probably about let's say the most would probably be 20 centimeters. That most of them would have, probably 15 centimeters, so about that much we're talking. And then the next wall. So the next wall you would have another layer of absorption and the outside wall as well. So that might be another gyprock wall, it could be brick wall, but the main idea of this isolation is that you have an absorptive layer or a couple of absorptive layers from the inside of your chamber to the outside of the chamber. You have a gap of open space where the air is moving in that area, and then you have your next absorption level and your outside wall. That's what isolation is. For floor, you could have a raised floor. Underneath you would have a pocket of air again. You'd have sand and then maybe another layer of something else, and sand again, or concrete depending. You could also use springs. There's a whole heap of different ways of doing this. But this is where you can see it would start to get quite expensive. For ceilings, again, it's the same thing, the same concept all around that wall. You want the ceiling material, you would have some absorption on that, you would have a space, more absorption, and another type of ceiling. Now, if you're using metals and corrugated irons in your warehouse or something, it can start to cause little problems, things like that, but a lot of that should hopefully be reduced the way that it's constructed and the way that you look at constructing the entire room. Okay, so that's isolation. Keeping sound out, keeping sound in, and creating a space where it reduces the amount of dB level from inside compared to outside. Isolation. The next one is, next issue is, as I said before, absorption. Now, absorption is extremely critical. Absorption can be considered with your wall material, as we've already said. It could be gyprock, it could be wood, it could be other types of fiberglass paneling, polyurethane, which is probably not the best one, all sorts of different materials. Now, we spoke a little bit last week and the week before about what's called absorption coefficients. Now, that is the amount of absorption that that material, the wall makes, can allow to absorb into itself without being reflected. And they have, I guess you would say, percentage rates. It's called a coefficient. And so if your coefficient was, say, 0.5, that means it would be reducing 50% or absorbing 50% of the energy that's hitting that from a direct sound, or from direct modes, as we spoke before, or what they call incident source, or the source wave. Okay, so essentially what I'm saying is the sound travels across a room in a free field, it hits the walls, okay. As it hits the walls, some of that energy, depending on what you've made the walls from, will absorb that sound, and the continuing reflective sound off of that will become resonant. Okay, it's a redirected sound. Okay, so it's not the original sound, it's from the source, it's a redirected sound, and it becomes resonant. Okay, depending on frequency, depending on the travel, it's basically, I think it comes on an axial mode, so it's a specific direction, hits the walls, hits the floor and bottom, floor and ceiling, and then becomes another type of energy, a reflective energy, which can create reverb, or it could become a flutter, other transient phenomena. There's a whole lot of things that are going on, so I'm trying to reduce all these complexities into simple things that we can understand when we're constructing our room. Now, if you have a look around behind me, you'll notice that the wall behind me is actually very bare. It's a concrete wall. The wall to my left here is also concrete. Behind this camera is a window, so I've got glass there. And when I'm mixing in here, it can be a little bit complex because I do have quite high ceilings. Okay, so what I do, essentially when I'm mixing sometimes, is I open the back window behind the camera, and which is also beyond the speaker, and I open the back door. Now, that creates an open channel for the sound to really travel through, and it really reduces a lot of reflections. But if I was to record, it's going to cause problems because there's noise coming from outside to inside. So I haven't isolated that properly, and I don't have a lot of absorption in here, or absorptive treatment in here to record well, unless I'm doing close miking or something like that. If I'm close miking with voice, I would need a lot more, and you're still going to get reflections from outside. So I'd want a really flat room for recording vocals. Okay, that's very important. If you are recording guitar and you have an electric guitar and you have a close mic, you know, a lot of the flooded or any kind of reflective sound should most likely not reach that microphone, depending on whether it's cardioid or, you know, other types of polarity, depending on its proximity to the speaker. If even it's right up, you may get a little bit, but if you're constantly playing, it should reduce some of that quite a lot. So at the moment, we're talking about absorption, and we're talking about the materials that create your walls and your room. Okay, now we're talking about absorption coefficients. That's how much the wall is, or that surface material is able to absorb from the initial sound, from the direct sound that's coming at it. Okay, so if you're in a room, as we've said, I've got concrete walls, I've got a window behind me, I've got a door behind me, but nothing's really been treated properly. So I'm still going to have a lot of those reflections going on. I'm going to have a lot of reflective sound. I'm going to have what's called standing waves, and that comes from resonant frequencies. Frequencies that have reflected off the surface, and they're now coming to create a different type of sonic energy. I hope that makes sense so far. So how do we treat all these standing waves that are moving and reflecting around each other? Okay, well, we use what's called diffusion. Okay, and diffusion is a type of a tool that you would use, and you've probably seen these in every picture. I'll be putting up pictures throughout. Diffusion is a technique that's used to redirect resonance and redirect the direct sound out into the room, but also absorb. So it's assisting in absorbing and breaking down a lot of those frequencies and things. Now, with absorption and with absorption tools, you can look at things like curtains and materials and surfaces. I know you might notice in some rehearsal rooms that you play at, they're lined with carpet, or they might be lined with curtains themselves. And just the simple fact that they're waved and with curtains, or the carpets, they're thick and they have foam underneath. A lot of this stuff is very absorbent, so it's going to reduce that. But if it's layered all around the outside everywhere, just carelessly and just to reduce sound, you may notice that the room could be quite dead and flat and dull. So if you're going to use treatments like this, or any kind of treatment, it has to be done carefully, it has to be done with some nous and some good knowledge. Okay, but it's not that hard to get. Okay, especially when you watch my videos. So what we're talking about now is we have reflective sound in the room. It's moving around. It's coming out of your speakers or out of your speaker box, and obviously we're talking mainly at the moment about monitoring rooms. It's a room where you sit and listen to your music. So if you're doing DJ music, you know, it's coming back at you, and you want to be able to get the best sound you can. Okay. Now, we have all those waves moving in the room. We have to find a way to break them down. So diffusion is the way that we do that. Now, there's a lot of different types of diffusion traps. You can use convex. You might have noticed these in rooms. It'll be a convex or a curved, frontal curved surface that's made of materials and some other absorptive stuff. It might have wool. It's a certain type of insulation wool. They may be using other types of things, and it just depends on whether the material you're using is fibrous or porous. There's about 7 different types of absorptive materials, or absorptive types, I should say. There's additive absorption, there's porous, there's fibrous, there's membrane, all different types of ones. And they all just differ in the way that they treat the reflective energy coming off of them. Okay, it will trap some, it will reflect other parts. You can actually design traps to be focused on receiving certain frequencies. So if you want a low frequency trap, you generally put them in the corners because a lot of low frequencies tends to build up in corners a bit more. So you would put it in there and you would fill it with a very specific type of absorption, which we can talk about later on. Now, the different types of diffusion can be focused on different types of frequencies, but its purpose mainly is to scatter. Okay, it's to scatter what they call incident sound, or the direct sound traveling from the speaker. So as this music comes out, or the sound is coming out of your speakers, it hits the diffusive material or the diffusive tools and scatters it and breaks it up, and it also, in doing that, reduces quite a bit of energy. But you still are able to keep some of that sound there, so it's not dying off completely. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is diffraction. Now, there's a difference between diffraction and diffusion. Diffusion is about scattering the sound, breaking it up, reducing and affecting resonance and things like that. Diffraction is the movement of sound around specific objects. Okay, so diffraction will be the result of a sound wave traveling across a free field or across open space, and then when it comes up against different types of objects that will interfere with it, perhaps two walls set apart, one's sort of more forward and one's further back, the sound will hit this wall, bend around and come and move across the surface of this wall as well. Now, if they have sharp edges, things like that, especially actual monitor speakers, the edges of your mixing desks, the edges of your tools that you have on the desk, the speaker, the monitor, all these things, if you can find more rounded edges, that's actually quite a benefit for you. Okay, because when you have diffraction, where the sound is moving through a particular object or across the surface of objects, you will find that it will gather energy at the edges of the especially sharp edges of those corners and things. So you want to find a way to break that down, diffuse that a little bit. A lot of it you just can't be helped, and your ears are not really going to be that sensitive to it. However, when you're mixing and things, if you can reduce all these issues with sound, you're going to get a better product. You're going to get a more neutral product that sounds the way it should sound. Okay, you're going to reduce the amount of reverberation in the room that your ears are detecting. You're going to reduce the amount of resonance that's built up energy, and you're going to reduce the amount of that as well. So these are all important factors. Okay, now there is one called refaction, right? However, that's more to do with the way that sound moves in liquid, and it doesn't really apply to studios unless you mix underwater, which is unlikely. So I won't worry about going into that one. So there's our 4 issues. Okay, now this is getting a bit longer than I thought, quicker than I thought. So we have isolation, keeping sound in and outside of a room or a space or an environment that you're recording or monitoring in. There is absorption, which is how to absorb and receive direct sound as well as reflective sound. Okay. There is diffusion as well. Diffusion redirects sound from a direct sound and turns it into a scattered sound, reducing its effect for the most part and trying to control those resonances. Diffraction is about the surfaces and the way that sound is moving across the surface of your room, whether it's the walls, objects on your table, your own body, your ceiling. And so all these can be affected and changed, and they also change the sound of your room. Okay, so your room could be a good room, it could be suitable, but if you have a lot of sharp edges in there, and if you don't have any diffusive material, and the surfaces of your walls and things are very reflective, which means they're not absorbing that sound, then you could be in for some troubles. Okay, you're going to have some standing waves. That is energy that is built up, and they become modes. Okay, they become resonant modes, and they become difficult to deal with. And they occur at certain levels and frequencies within your room, and how they're moving between the walls and things in your room. So you don't want that. Okay, so the main goal is to have a natural environment with minimal reflections. Okay, you can still have acoustic reflections, but we're always trying to get that flatter sound, but it should sound natural. Okay, anyway, that's going to do it for now. That's four topics there that I've kind of covered. You can find more in Studio Design by Philip Newell, Newell. It's in my first video at the end. So keep watching, please subscribe, share it around, and if it's been helpful. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of these issues next week. So thanks for watching. Audio Energy Shannon, and please subscribe. See you next time. Cheers.